So I'm going to start by saying today's gospel passage is dangerous. Yes, you've heard me correctly. I am saying Jesus's words are dangerous. I'm convinced this simple passage is both subversive and, if misunderstood, has great potential to do greater harm, especially in our times. Let me repeat, this gospel we just heard is dangerous. Now bear with me as I try to explain why. First, it is dangerous because if taken literally and out of its original context, it could be easily read to say, take all the abuse that comes your way and do it for Jesus. One might read that in every circumstance, Christians must follow this scripture literally. And I'm afraid that in our modern ears, we might hear Jesus saying, the bullies should always win, might is right, and that it is not for Christians to wield. So take it when the powerful come after you. And some may preach that that is what this Bible passage is saying, and that it must be taken literally and followed blindly to be a good Christian. But I will not. In fact, I believe that it would be dangerous and misguided to understand this passage that way. On the other hand, taking the opposing view that would somehow say that this scripture no longer applies to our lives today, or that we don't need to worry about this passage anymore. So go ahead, fight back, fight like hell, take what's yours, skip all the generosity, because the season of being a kumbaya Christian is now over. But that would not be listening to Jesus very well. So perhaps you figured out by now, I disagree with both of these ideas. And I want to offer what I believe is the good news from Luke's gospel today. In other words, when we understand the larger context and listen as Jesus calls us to do, we can see that the good news here is freedom from abuse. And the only thing required is to listen to Jesus. Because Jesus makes it clear that Luke has good news for all, especially the poor, and if we have ears to hear it. I would also like to say to you that this passage and what it is saying is challenging. And it's asking each of us to rethink. And if we're open to hearing what Jesus was doing, we will know how to live together. So let's start where our gospel today begins. In verse 27, to you who are listening, I like to think that whenever Jesus points out that we're supposed to be listening, we should do so. We should pay a little extra attention whenever Jesus says, listen up. And then he launches right into saying, 1, love your enemies. 2, do good to those who hate you. 3, bless those who curse you. And 4, pray for those who mistreat you. And I don't know exactly what the crowds in Jesus' time thought about this list, but I have to say, it has me asking, What did you just say, Jesus? We have heard this passage so often, and I would dare say have ignored it. So we may not catch how radical what he's saying here really is. So then Jesus continues by saying, if someone slaps your cheek, turn and let them do it again. And if someone takes your coat, give them your shirt. And this is where I ask, wait. So is Jesus saying he wants his followers to be naked, poor, and going without? And are we being asked to actively participate in our abuse? Am I missing something here, Jesus? If we really think about what loving our enemies would look like, it's kind of weird. Because first you have to ask yourself, who is my enemy? Interestingly, when Jesus suggested that people needed to love their neighbor, it prompted them to ask, well, who is my neighbor? And of course, we know that wasn't the correct response when we're supposed to be, and we are commanded to love one another. But I do think if we're going to learn how to love our enemies, which I do believe we're called to do, we will need to spend some time thinking about who our enemies are and why. And I guess I want to ask, wouldn't it be easier, Jesus, just to tell us to love one another and do it well? It just seems to me that this is a lot of focus, this sermon, this piece of this sermon, on what's negative and the people who are negative in our lives. Do good to those who hate you. Okay, well, all of them? How do I even know who hates me? And hate's a really strong word. How about those who just dislike me? And bless those who curse you. Now, I don't want to miss one. Is this just the in-person curses? Or how about those who curse me behind my back? Or when somebody mumbles it under their breath? Or how about on social media? Frankly, Jesus seems to be spending a lot of time and doing a lot of work here. And it would just be a lot easier for him to say, love everybody. And I can get my head around the idea of praying for those who mistreat me. But again, why is all the focus on these people who are hurting us? How will this help us? Why are we being asked to do this, Jesus? And frankly, the slapping and turning the other cheek, well, that seems a bit excessive. I can't imagine having to say to my child, if some bully at school slaps you, you just go ahead, you turn to them the other cheek, and let them do it again, and do it all for Jesus. This is hardly a good strategy for playground success. And give to everyone who asks. Everyone who asks. Let people take what belongs to you. Do not try to get it back. It feels like Jesus isn't being very realistic here or hopeful. Especially when you consider the original audience is a bunch of vulnerable people with nothing to spare. The more we examine these words, we might want to just disregard them as strange and let them go as teachings altogether. But what if we are misinterpreting this entire message and who the original and actual first audience was? What if we all misunderstood and heard it all wrong? If there is one thing we are very good at in our day, it's misinterpreting messages and who they're for and who should even get to deliver them in the first place. But that's a sermon for another time. So how do we interpret Jesus' words here in Luke and its companion passage in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount? These days, that passage has some of us feeling kind of nervous and asking, please don't say anything political or offensive. So maybe we should start with a simpler ask. Aren't all of Jesus' sermons just plain and straightforward and for everyone? Aren't Jesus' words meant for all people and for all times? Maybe we should spend a little time wondering if the people of Jesus' day were all that similar to us today. Or if Jesus' society was similar to our society, and how that might impact this reading. I mean, people are people, right? And my gut instinct is to say, yes, in all times, people have kind of had the same basic needs, and people are people. But then I have to say, no. Societally, our structures are very different. The way we live our lives are vastly different. And how we read the scriptures, in some ways, has to be both dependent on what it was originally saying in that time and what's going on in our own. So let's look at how to look at it. In Jesus' day, not unlike our own, there were haves and there were have-nots. And it was understood that in Jesus' day, being a have came with responsibilities to others that we may not fully understand. But in the ancient world, one's honor was everything. So if you had means and great wealth in that day, and very few did, you understood your duty was to give, to lend, to sponsor, to provide for the society at large. And if for no other reason, you could do this to protect yourself and your wealth from being plundered. You might donate to causes, make grand gestures, throw parties to celebrate, and erect monuments to enrich and better everyone. Don't confuse this here. It was not necessarily out of benevolence, though some would have had that as their motivation. But in the ancient world, one would give to be seen and to be thought of as great among others. We might ask, well, what was in it for them? It made it so that people were indebted to them for their patronage, and that would make their reach and their power greater. And as a great person, it would have been required and expected for you to support others, because most people at that time were extremely poor and overworked and could barely procure for themselves their daily bread. So if the masses were not pleased, they might protest. Of course, each person knew their place and stayed in it, in their circle from both high to low. But what was most important was your ability to influence others. And it behooved the very wealthy to make sure the lives of the masses weren't unlivable. And this was a constant balancing act to be managed, and everyone knew, accepted, and played their parts, or didn't. And then there was trouble, unrest, revolts, and revolution. So back to Jesus and our gospel. Who were the people assembled at Jesus, in this crowd that Jesus had asked to listen up? Weren't they just random crowds of vulnerable people following Jesus and his disciples? Aren't these just the poor and tired peasants waiting to be fed their daily bread and to hear a little good news? Yes, much of the crowd that was there followed Jesus because he spoke to them of change and a time that would come. His message gave them hope in their days because Jesus spoke of injustices being set to right and the promises of God's kingdom to come. And in this message, he puts before them the social contract as it was understood and said that something better, a day was coming where things would be put to right. Jesus preached the good news, and here in this gospel that Luke chose to pen, we find Jesus saying what was important for all to hear. Jesus spoke about what should be, how things would best be ordered. Who would have been listening? Well, there were the poor who were there and of need of their daily bread, but they were not the only intended hearers. As we often find with Jesus' message, he has more than one thing that he's doing. And these are the hearers that he asked in that beginning portion to listen up. So with this societal understanding of Jesus and the better understanding of who the office is, who the audience is, I'd like to examine the rest of the scriptures here. So starting at verse 31, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Well, this is, of course, what we call today our golden rule. And we understand this to have universal appeal and application. And today, after many, many years of having this preached as a sermon and our ability to walk in this as Christians, that's how it should be understood. But I would say that in its original context, when Jesus was saying it here for the first time, he was using it to narrow the scope of his more particular audience. And if you're still unsure who that particular audience is, listen up. In verse 32, Jesus goes on to say, if you love only those who love you, and in verse 33, if you only do good to those who do good to you, you don't get credit. Credit? Why is Jesus mentioning credit? He goes on to say that even sinners do that much. And by the way, sinners, enemies, and the wicked are synonymous in this passage whenever you hear them. So something strange is definitely happening here. Just under the surface in this passage, we times it is just like, love everybody, even if they're your enemy. There's something else going on when he is speaking to this crowd. Because he mentions here about lending as well. Surely Jesus is not only speaking to daily bread needing poor, because they're not in a position to lend to anyone, certainly not enough that Jesus would need to preach a sermon to them about it. No, Jesus must be addressing others as well. So remember those wealthy patrons I mentioned, the ones that would be in a position and have the responsibility to be lenders. This is the key to understanding who this passage is addressing here. And this helps us to understand the context for what's coming next. Love your enemies, or sinners, or the wicked. Jesus is speaking to the haves and their obligation in their dealings with the have-nots. But Jesus is also certainly talking to the have-nots as well. And I think he wants them to understand that they're to be generous, but I think he also wants them to understand what treatment they should be able to expect. Jesus begins this passage by saying, listen up. And now we know he wants to make certain those who are wealthy enough to be lenders, the ones who are interested in profiting from their good deeds, the ones who want to be great. Jesus said, you must love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, even those who curse you, and to pray for those who do you harm. Jesus is calling all, but especially those with stature, to be the bigger person, even when slapping is involved. Jesus' message was for those who with great honor and wealth needed to be reminded of the social contract and how not to be overbearing with those who are lowly and in their debt. This is a sermon about the responsibility of strength. And when we consider Jesus' words and that they were actually meant for the powerful and not only for the weak and the poor, we see this passage is not about how to be a doormat or how to put up with the bully's abuse. No, this sermon Jesus is giving here is a reminder to the haves and to the have-nots that God requires them, those who have means, to be the bigger person, to understand their responsibility and the power that comes with wealth, and that it is by fulfilling their obligation with great love is how they become. So Jesus is saying to these patrons and these benefactors in verse 5, where he reiterates what he said in verse 27 and 28, love your enemies, do good even to the ones who you do not like or who mistreat you, and do so without getting anything back in return. Jesus pivots again to say, your reward, your credit, is being a child of the Most High. And in verse 35, Jesus states that God, who we know is the greatest and deserves all honor, is both kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. And of course, Jesus spells it out plain when he says, we are called to do the same. Be merciful, it says, just as your Father is merciful, in verse 36. And friends, the strong and the wealthy are called to have mercy. I'm called. You're called. As we are the haves of our day, we are called to be merciful. Jesus takes it a step further and says, those with strength, wealth, and honor are being called by Jesus to have mercy on those who don't, and to give generously even to those who are ungrateful, wicked, and those who want to do you harm. And this is truly dangerous if it's misunderstood. And in verse 37, he continues by saying, do not judge, or you will be judged. Do not condemn, or you will be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. In other words, you don't get to judge who you're being called to be generous to, nor do you get to decide whether they're to be condemned. And perhaps of most importance, if you want to be forgiven, then you must forgive. Period. Jesus reiterates that we do not get to have preferences or be exclusive in our generosity. And Jesus leaves no room for qualifiers. But Jesus really drives this point home and makes sure the correct audience members hear when he says in verse 38, give, and it will be given to you. Jesus is speaking to those who have extra. He uses language that would only apply to those of strong financial stature, able to do commerce in bulk, and that is not the majority of this crowd of poor people before Jesus, because they have nothing stocked up. Jesus is speaking here about market shares and commerce when he says, give generously, perhaps even recklessly, and God will pay you back. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. I mean, that's the imagery of a big old bag of food or spices or money. And it will be poured into your lap, it says. In other words, the reward of the strong and the wealthy come from God. And it's just the way we like it. Full to the brim, overflowing, and in our favor. But Jesus moves us here in this passage from do unto others, especially the poor, your enemy, sinners, the ungrateful and wicked, to be like God. And do the things the way that God would do it to us, that we would have God do it to us. Because in fact, the measure we use will be the very measure God will use for us. And with that, I just see Jesus, mic drop, Jesus out. We're called to love one another and to treat everyone generously like family. And you may still be asking, and I certainly am, well, what about the wicked people in our times? Are we really called to love them? And to this I say, vengeance is the Lord's, and we can leave things with God. And if you don't understand how that's going to be justice, well, we read the psalm today, and it makes clear how the wicked will end up. And by the way, the wicked includes the wealthy and the strong who do not do their duty to the poor and the weak. Jesus is primarily interested here in the vulnerable people among us and calling those of us with means to be generous according to our gifts in this life. And when we are, Jesus will reward us accordingly, both in this life and in the next. And I'll leave you here with this quote from St. Maximus the Confessor from his first century of love. If we detect any trace of hatred in our hearts against any person for any fault, we are utterly estranged from love of God, since love of God absolutely precludes us from hating any person. Blessed equally. Amen.